In 1889, Clara Bennett traveled more than 700 miles to Wyoming to marry a man she had known only through letters. 3 days
You
later,
promised
she
me
called
we
off
would
the
leave
wedding.
this place.
But as Clara stood
Why
at
are
the
you
train
hesitating
station,
now?
ready to return to Iowa,
We don't have much
a
time
cowboy
left.
she barely knew stepped
The
beside
train
her,
is leaving.
put his hand
Let
on
me
her
know.
arm, and said,
I
"She's
can't
mine."
let you leave like
Clara
this.
pulled away.
Please stay.
"I belong to no man." She thought that would be the end of it. Then the cowboy's 26-year-old
Please
horse
don't
saw the
go.
silver
We
bracelet
have
on
to talk
Clara's
about
wrist,
this now
the
before
only
it's too
thing
late.
she had left from her dead father. The old horse froze. Then it turned toward a stone barn it hadn't approached in 15 years. What Moses remembered would change Clara's reason for coming west, and the cowboy who had nearly lost her before he ever had the right to ask her to stay. Subscribe to the channel, and let's begin Clara's story. The summer of 1889 lay hot and bright across the Wyoming plains. Dry grass rolled beneath an enormous blue sky, and the little railroad town shimmered in dust as the westbound train sighed to a stop. Clara Bennett stepped onto the platform carrying one brown traveling case and enough uncertainty for a dozen journeys. At 31, Clara was a slender woman of average height, with fair skin lightly freckled across her nose, gray-green eyes, and chestnut-brown hair pinned neatly beneath a modest traveling hat. For years of widowhood had left faint lines beside her eyes that had not been there at 27. But grief had not made her fragile. If anything, it had made her deliberate. Her late husband, Nathan, had died after a sudden winter illness, leaving Clara with a rented room in Iowa, a sewing machine, and the uncomfortable discovery that sympathy could not pay for coal. She had survived by altering dresses, repairing work shirts, and stitching until her fingers cramped beneath lamplight. That work had become more than income. It was proof that when life removed the person beside her, she could still stand. She had traveled more than 700 miles because of Samuel Whitmore. Samuel waited near the depot railing, holding his hat against his chest. He was 37, tall and lean rather than broad, with sun-browned skin, neatly combed dark blonde hair, and a square face softened by thoughtful brown eyes. A short, carefully trimmed beard followed his jaw. He worked as a bookkeeper for a cattle company, dressed plainly, spoke politely, and had the habit of considering his words before releasing them. Clara recognized him immediately from the photograph he had mailed 5 months earlier. "Miss Bennett." "Mr. Whitmore." Their handshake was awkward but warm. For nearly 6 months, their relationship had existed through paper and ink. Samuel had written about Wyoming sunsets, church suppers, and wanting a peaceful home. Clara had written about Iowa winters, sewing, widowhood, and her hope that a second marriage might be built less on youthful excitement and more on companionship. Neither had lied. That was what made the next 3 days so painful. The disagreement surfaced over breakfast on Clara's third morning in town. Samuel casually mentioned that once they married, Clara would no longer need to take sewing orders. She initially thought he meant she would not be forced to work. Then she understood. "You expect me to stop sewing?" Samuel looked genuinely surprised. "You won't need the money. My wages are enough for a wife." Clara slowly lowered her coffee cup. "Samuel, I didn't learn to sew because I was waiting for someone to rescue me from it." His brow tightened. "I'm offering you security, and I'm grateful, but you're asking me to surrender something that belongs to me." Samuel was not cruel. That almost made it worse. His own mother had raised 6 children while his father worked long days, and Samuel had grown up believing a good husband protected his wife from the burden of earning money. To him, asking Clara to work after marriage would have felt like failure. To Clara, being forbidden to work felt like disappearing. For 2 nights, she wrestled with the decision. She had traveled 700 miles. People back in Iowa knew why she had come. Returning unmarried would invite whispers. Worse, Clara had allowed herself to imagine Samuel's house becoming home. But embarrassment was a poor reason to marry. On the morning of the 4th day, she told him, "I can't marry you." Samuel stared at the floor for several seconds. Hurt moved quietly across his face. Finally he nodded. "I suppose we wrote the same words and meant different things." Clara's eyes burned. "I think we did." He did not insult her, demand repayment, or try to frighten her into reconsidering. He simply wished her well. By afternoon, Clara had purchased an eastbound ticket to Iowa. She was standing near the depot with her traveling case when Luke Mercer approached. Luke was 40, a broad-shouldered cowboy just over 6 feet tall, with a weather-darkened face, angular cheekbones, deep-set blue-gray eyes, and dark brown hair beginning to silver at the temples. Several days of rough beard covered a strong jaw. His hands were scarred from rope and fence wire, and he carried himself with the restless readiness of a man accustomed to solving problems before they grew teeth. Widowhood had sharpened that habit. 6 years earlier, his wife had died after a sudden fever while Luke was 2 days away on a cattle drive. Ever since, hesitation had felt dangerously similar to regret. He had helped Clara with her case when she first arrived and exchanged only a handful of conversations with her since. Now he saw the ticket in her hand. Before either could speak, a railway porter glanced between them. "Your husband traveling with you, ma'am?" Luke answered before Clara could. "She's with me." His hand settled instinctively on Clara's upper arm. The mistake lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Clara pulled away as though burned. "I belong to no man, Mr. Mercer." Luke froze. The confidence vanished from his face. He immediately dropped his hand. "You're right." Clara stared at him. Luke stepped backward, giving her space. "I had no right. I'm sorry." No excuse followed. The whistle sounded. Clara turned toward the train, furious with Luke, disappointed in Samuel, and suddenly exhausted by men who seemed capable of imagining her future before asking what she wanted. Then something across the street caught her eye. A handwritten sign hung crookedly inside a shop window. "Seamstress wanted. Steady work. ****. Clara looked at the sign, then at her ticket. For the first time since leaving Iowa, a strange thought occurred to her. She had come west to marry Samuel. That plan had failed. But perhaps Samuel had never been the only reason the journey could matter. The conductor called for boarding. Clara tightened her fingers around the ticket. Then she stepped away from the train. 30 days, she decided. She would give Wyoming 30 days. After that, whatever happened next would be her choice. 3 days after watching the eastbound train leave without her, Clara Bennett had a rented room, $12 less in her purse, and exactly 27 days remaining on the promise she had made to herself. She rented the upstairs room of a narrow boarding house near the commercial street, paying a week in advance and keeping the rest of her savings, including enough for another train ticket, inside a cloth envelope sewn into her traveling case. She wanted one thing understood, especially by herself. Staying in Wyoming was an experiment, not dependence. The seamstress sign she had seen from the depot belonged to Margaret Hale, a 63-year-old widow who operated a small millinery and repair shop between a pharmacy and a harness maker. Margaret was short and wiry, with pale blue eyes, weathered fair skin, and iron-gray hair twisted into a severe knot. Her black dresses were plain enough for mourning, although her husband had been dead 11 years. She had supported herself ever since, and years of customers asking for impossible repairs by impossible deadlines had given her a dry manner and very little patience for excuses. When Clara introduced herself, Margaret did not ask about the abandoned wedding. She placed a badly torn riding coat on the counter. "Cowboy caught it on barbed wire," she said. "Owner thinks money can make cloth grow back." Clara examined the long tear near the shoulder. "When does he want it?" "Yesterday." For the first time in several difficult days, Clara smiled. Margaret almost did. "Sew it. If I can find your stitches tomorrow, you're not hired." Clara spent nearly 2 hours matching the damaged fabric, reinforcing the inside, and hiding the repair beneath the original seam. Margaret inspected it in silence, turning the coat toward the window. "You'll start Monday." There was no congratulation. Clara liked her immediately. Within a week, Clara discovered that Wyoming demanded different skills from Iowa. Fine hems still arrived, but so did torn riding coats, canvas bags, leather straps, saddle blankets, and gloves damaged by rope. Years of repairing Nathan's work clothes had taught her that beautiful stitching meant nothing if it failed under strain. Soon Margaret was quietly placing the difficult repairs on Clara's side of the table. Luke Mercer appeared late one afternoon. Clara saw him through the window and felt her shoulders tighten. He entered without flowers or gifts, removed his hat, and stopped several feet from the counter. "I owe you an apology that doesn't have a but attached to it." Margaret glanced between them, collected a box of ribbons, and disappeared deliberately into the back room. Luke looked uncomfortable, which Clara considered appropriate. "At the depot, I spoke as if you belonged to me," he said. "You don't." Clara studied him. "No, I don't. I know that now." "You should have known it then." "Yes, ma'am." He did not explain his widowhood or ask her to forgive the impulse that grief had helped create. He simply apologized and left. That mattered. Not enough to make Clara trust him, but enough that she stopped being angry every time she remembered his face. For days later, Luke returned leading an old horse. "This is business," he said cautiously. The gelding beside him was 26-year-old Moses, a tall dark bay horse whose once powerful body had softened with age. Gray hairs dusted his muzzle and temples, and a thin white scar curved across his left shoulder. His dark eyes remained remarkably clear. Luke explained that Moses had spent most of his life working cattle, but had become unusually selective with age. He tolerated familiar people, disliked strangers touching his face, and seemed convinced retirement meant everyone else should adjust to his schedule. "Sounds sensible," Clara said. Luke handed her a torn saddle blanket. Moses disagreed with a nail. "The nail one. Draw." Clara carried the blanket outside to check how the damaged edge sat beneath the saddle. Moses barely acknowledged her at first. Then Clara pushed back her sleeve. The old horse's head lifted. Clara stopped. Around her wrist was a narrow silver bracelet, scratched and dulled by decades. Inside were the initials T.B. It had belonged to her father, Thomas Bennett, who had died 8 years earlier after a lifetime of saying remarkably little about the years he had spent traveling before settling in Iowa. Moses stared at it. Luke's faint smile disappeared. "Moses." The horse stepped toward Clara. She resisted the instinct to retreat. Moses lowered his muzzle and touched the silver bracelet gently with his nose. Once, then again. His breathing changed. Luke moved closer, bewildered. "He doesn't do that." Moses suddenly turned away. He began walking toward the western edge of town. Luke caught the loose ring. Instead of stopping, Moses pulled against him with surprising determination. "Where's he going?" Clara asked. Luke stared beyond the buildings toward an abandoned section of the old Mercer property. There, partly hidden behind cottonwoods, stood a weathered stone barn. Luke's face had gone pale. "What is it?" For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at Moses. "That barn belonged to the ranch before my father died. We stopped using it years ago." Moses pulled again. Luke tightened his grip on the rein. "How long?" Luke looked at Clara. 15 years. Clara glanced down at her father's bracelet, then toward the distant barn. Moses was no longer looking at her. He was staring at that building with the rigid attention of an animal listening to something no one else could hear. And Clara understood with a sudden chill that frightened her more than she wanted Luke to see. The old horse had not recognized her. He had recognized something that belonged to a dead man. Luke did not try to stop Moses again. He walked beside the old gelding while Clara followed along the dusty road toward the abandoned Mercer property, the silver bracelet suddenly feeling heavier around her wrist. The stone barn stood beyond a sagging fence beneath several old cottonwoods, its gray walls stained by decades of Wyoming winters. Half the roof had been repaired with mismatched timber, and weeds reached almost to the rusted iron latch. Luke stopped at the door. "My father kept this place locked after we moved the cattle operations south. After he died, I never found much reason to open it." His father, Daniel Mercer, had been dead 12 years. Daniel had been a large, raw-boned cattleman with a crooked nose broken by a horse in his 20s, a thick brown beard that turned almost entirely gray before his death, and hands Luke remembered as permanently scarred. He had been generous with struggling neighbors, but stubborn about his own troubles. Losing Luke's mother young had made Daniel quieter, and he rarely spoke about the years before Luke was born. Luke forced the stiff lock open. Before Clara could ask anything, Moses stepped inside. The old horse did not hesitate. He crossed the dusty floor, past 2 empty stalls, and stopped at the last one on the northern wall. His nose lowered toward a collapsed wooden rack. Luke stared. He knows this place. Together they moved the rotten boards aside. Beneath them lay an old western saddle, its leather dried nearly black and cracked along the skirt. One stirrup was missing. Clara brushed away the dust. Something had been stamped beneath the rear edge. T. Bennett, 1864. Her breath caught. My father's name was Thomas Bennett. Luke crouched beside her. Bennett isn't exactly rare. No, Clara touched the worn leather. But 1864 was the year he came west. That was one of the few things Thomas had ever told his daughter. He had spent several years working cattle before returning east, but whenever Clara asked about Wyoming, he usually smiled and changed the subject. Moses lowered his muzzle over the saddle. Clara no longer believed in coincidence. They searched the stall carefully. Behind a loose plank, Luke found a narrow wooden box, swollen with age. Inside was a small ledger wrapped in oilcloth and a folded letter yellowed, almost brown at the edges. The ledger settled the question. Thomas Bennett appeared repeatedly beside another name, Daniel Mercer. There were records of cattle purchases, wages, feed, and several brief notes written in Thomas's unmistakable hand. Clara recognized the narrow letters immediately. One entry from 1865 stopped her. Daniel pulled me clear when the herd broke at Cottonwood, Washington. I would not be writing this otherwise. Luke read it twice. My father never told me. A later entry described a barn fire. Daniel had been trapped beneath a fallen beam while trying to release the horses. Thomas went back through the smoke and dragged him out. One man had saved the other. Then the debt had been returned. Clara unfolded the letter. It was addressed to Daniel, but apparently never sent because Thomas had left it among his belongings at the ranch. In it, Thomas explained that Clara's mother had become seriously ill in Iowa. He was going home and could not reasonably take a young horse on the long journey east. The horse was Moses. Clara looked toward the 26-year-old gelding. He was my father's? Luke nodded slowly. Looks that way. Thomas asked Daniel to keep Moses rather than sell him. The horse had been born on the Wyoming range and trusted Daniel nearly as much as Thomas. Near the bottom, the handwriting became less steady. Thomas wrote about his infant daughter, Clara, whom he had seen only briefly before returning west for one final season to settle his affairs. Then came the sentence. Clara read it aloud. If my daughter ever comes west, let Moses decide whether she belongs here. Silence filled the barn. Her eyes burned. For one foolish, vulnerable second, Clara looked at Luke. Do you think he meant? Luke understood before she finished. Me? Clara looked away, embarrassed. Luke shook his head. No. The answer was so immediate that she looked back. He pointed gently at the letter. He wrote here, Clara. Not with me. The words landed harder than any romantic answer could have. Only weeks earlier, Luke had put his hand on her arm and spoken as though proximity gave him a claim. Now the same man stood beside her, refusing an interpretation that would have benefited him. Moses shifted quietly behind them. Clara touched her bracelet. Perhaps her father had meant Wyoming. Perhaps he had simply written a sentimental thought to an old friend, never imagining his daughter would actually stand inside this barn decades later. She did not know. And for once, Luke did not try to tell her. As they stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, Clara looked at him differently. Not because their fathers had known each other. Not because an old horse had remembered her bracelet. But because Luke Mercer had finally understood something Thomas Bennett seemed to have understood 25 years earlier. Belonging was not something another person could declare for her. It was something Clara would have to decide for herself. In the 2 weeks after the discovery in the stone barn, Clara and Luke settled into something neither of them tried to name. Luke stopped assuming that an invitation once accepted remained permanently open. He asked before walking Clara home, asked whether she wanted company when visiting the Mercer property, and once, when he started repairing a loose hinge outside Margaret's shop without permission, caught himself halfway through reaching for his hammer. Would you like that fixed? He asked. Clara looked at the crooked hinge, then at him. I was wondering how long it would take you. Luke laughed. Progress, she discovered, did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it was simply a man learning to turn a statement into a question. Clara's own life grew busier. Margaret trusted her with more complicated orders, particularly riding coats and damage tack that required strong stitching. One July afternoon, Clara borrowed Margaret's small wagon to deliver repaired canvas covers and 2 coats to a ranch several miles outside town. The horse pulling it was Nell, a 14-year-old chestnut mare with a narrow white blaze and the patient temperament of an animal that had spent most of her life ignoring human foolishness. Margaret trusted Nell because she rarely spooked, which was fortunate because thunder was already gathering beyond the western hills when Clara began the return journey. The storm reached her faster than expected. Rain swept sideways across the road. Lightning cracked close enough to make Nell jump against the traces. Clara leaned forward, trying to calm her, when the wagon's right wheel struck a washout hidden beneath muddy water. Wood snapped. The wagon lurched violently. Nell screamed and pulled forward as the broken wheel folded beneath the axle. Clara hit the sideboard hard enough to bruise her shoulder, but she stayed conscious. The wagon began sliding toward the ditch, and the frightened mare fought the harness. Clara's fear arrived cold and immediate. Then training replaced panic. Years of repairing work gear had taught her what tension did to leather. If Nell kept pulling while the wagon rolled, a trace could trap or injure her. Clara climbed down into the rain, speaking steadily while her hands worked. She released one buckle, cut a jammed strap with the small sewing knife she carried, and freed Nell seconds before the wagon settled sideways into the ditch. "There," Clara whispered, shaking almost as badly as the horse. "Neither of us is dying tonight." The nearest occupied ranch was miles away, but Clara remembered passing an abandoned line shack farther back. One rein had torn during the accident. From her work satchel, she took heavy thread, an awl, and a strip of leather intended for another repair. Her hands trembled from cold, yet she reinforced the damaged section enough to lead Nell safely. They reached the shack after dark. The roof leaked, but one corner remained dry. Clara found an old iron stove, several pieces of abandoned firewood, and, to her delight, a dented coffee pot. By midnight, she had a small fire burning and Nell sheltered beside the building. Back in town, Margaret became worried when Clara failed to return before dark. Luke heard about it shortly afterward and rode out with 2 ranch hands, following the road through rain until tracks became nearly impossible to distinguish. They searched most of the night. At dawn, Luke saw smoke rising beyond a low ridge. He galloped toward it. He dismounted before his horse had completely stopped and pushed through the shack door. Clara was sitting beside the stove with a blanket around her shoulders and a tin cup of coffee between both hands. She looked up. Luke stared at her, then at the fire, then at Nell standing safely outside. "I spent all night thinking I had to rescue you." Clara took another sip. "You're a little late." For several seconds Luke said nothing. Then he laughed. Clara joined him, partly from exhaustion and partly because surviving something made laughter feel unexpectedly precious. Luke did not tell her she should never travel alone again. He did not take the reins from her or turn the accident into proof that she needed him. Instead, he inspected the broken wagon and asked, "Want help getting this home?" Clara smiled. Yes. That single word meant more because he had waited for it. Several days later, Margaret called Clara into the back room. Business had increased enough that she wanted Clara to remain permanently, not merely as an employee, but eventually as a partner. "You've earned it," Margaret said. "Don't confuse that with charity." That same afternoon, another possibility arrived by mail. Clara's aunt in Iowa had written to say that a respected dressmaking shop in Council Bluffs needed an experienced seamstress. The position paid well, and Clara could live near family again. For the first time, Clara had 2 futures. Wyoming offered work she had earned, Margaret's partnership, a past she had unexpectedly rediscovered, and Luke. Iowa offered family, security, familiar streets, and a profession she already understood. Neither choice represented failure. That made choosing harder. On July 12th, Clara walked to the railroad office alone. She placed her money on the counter. 1 ticket to Council Bluffs. The clerk asked when. Clara hesitated only once. July 18th. When she stepped outside with the ticket tucked safely inside her purse, she felt no relief. 6 days remained. And this time, no one but Clara Bennett would decide whether she boarded that train. Luke learned about Clara's ticket 3 days before July 18th. Margaret mentioned the date without drama when he stopped by with a repaired buckle, and for one dangerous second, every instinct in him returned. He imagined riding to Clara's boarding house, telling her what the last month had meant to him, reminding her of the barn, their fathers, Moses, the storm, anything that might place one more weight on the Wyoming side of her decision. Then he remembered the first afternoon at the depot. He had put his hand on Clara before she had given him permission and spoken as though wanting something gave him a right to claim it. Luke had spent weeks learning the opposite. If Clara stayed because he made leaving painful, he would have learned nothing. So he made the hardest choice available to a man whose entire life had taught him to act before opportunities disappeared. He did nothing. On July 18th, Clara settled her boarding account, packed her traveling case, and walked alone to the station. The morning was painfully ordinary. No storm darkened the horizon. No broken wheel delayed her. No mysterious letter arrived. The eastbound train came exactly when it was supposed to. Clara looked for Luke despite herself. He was not there. The disappointment surprised her. Then she understood why his absence mattered. He was letting her leave. The conductor called for passengers. Clara joined the boarding line with her ticket in one hand. Iowa offered family, respectable work, familiar streets, and a future she could build without depending on anyone. Going home would not be surrender. That made the decision hers. Her thumb brushed the silver bracelet around her wrist. Let Moses decide whether she belongs here. For weeks Clara had wondered what Thomas meant. Standing beside the train, she finally understood that Moses had decided nothing. The old horse had merely led her to a forgotten door. Behind it, Clara had discovered her father's history, but history was not an instruction. Moses had shown her what had been. Clara still had to choose what would be. She looked toward town. Margaret's shop was there. Work she had earned was there. A partnership waited there. So did people who now knew Clara not as Samuel Whitmore's intended bride or Luke Mercer's possible sweetheart, but as the woman who could repair a riding coat so neatly a rancher would spend 10 minutes searching for the tear. The conductor called again. Clara stepped out of line. The train left without her. She did not run to Luke. Instead, she carried her case directly to Margaret's shop. Margaret looked up from a hat frame when Clara entered. I thought you had a train. I did. And Clara placed her case beside the counter. If the partnership is still available, I accept. Margaret studied her for several seconds. Monday morning. 7. That was all. It was exactly the answer Clara wanted. Wyoming came first. Luke came afterward. The following afternoon, Clara sent a short note asking him to meet her at the depot. Luke arrived leading Moses, whose gray muzzle and slow, dignified walk made him look considerably less concerned about romance than either human beside him. Luke stopped several feet away. I thought you left. I changed my mind. About Iowa? About Wyoming. Hope moved across Luke's face, but he kept his distance. Did you stay because of me? Clara shook her head. No. Luke absorbed the answer. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Clara smiled too. You seem pleased. I am. Why? Because if you'd stayed only for me, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering whether I'd taken something from you again. Clara felt her throat tighten. No, she said softly. I chose Wyoming before I came looking for you. Luke nodded. I know what I want, Clara, but I finally understand that knowing what I want doesn't tell me what you want. Then he extended one hand. Palm upward. Open. He did not step toward her. Clara stared at it. This was the same man who, weeks earlier, had placed that hand on her arm and declared, she's with me. Now it held nothing, claimed nothing, demanded nothing. Clara stepped forward and placed her hand in his. Luke's fingers closed gently only after hers had settled there. Behind them, Moses sneezed explosively. Clara jumped. Luke laughed so hard he had to turn his head. That, Clara said, trying not to laugh herself, is what my father trusted to decide my future? Moses sneezed again, apparently offended. By autumn, Clara and Luke married quietly. Clara did not leave her profession. Margaret kept her promise, and before winter a new sign hung above the shop. Hale and Bennett, Millinery and Repairs. Clara's silver bracelet remained on her wrist. Not because Thomas Bennett had chosen Wyoming for his daughter. Not because Moses had. And certainly not because Luke Mercer had. Clara had chosen it herself. And the man she eventually loved had finally learned that the right hand was not the one strong enough to hold her. It was the one willing to remain open until she chose to reach for it. Maybe the greatest miracle in Clara Bennett's story was never that an old horse remembered a silver bracelet after all those years. Maybe the miracle began much earlier, when a grieving woman found enough courage to travel 700 miles toward a future she could not see. Clara came to Wyoming believing she was supposed to marry one man. When that dream ended, it would have been easy to believe the entire journey had been a mistake. But sometimes, God allows one plan to fall apart because our lives are larger than the plan we made. We often pray for miracles expecting something unmistakable, a door suddenly opening, a problem disappearing, or an answer arriving exactly when we ask for it. But God does not always work through thunder. Sometimes, He works through a train we choose not to board. Sometimes through work that restores our dignity. Sometimes through an old letter hidden for 25 years. And sometimes through a faithful old horse who remembers a road everyone else has forgotten. Moses did not choose Clara's future. Luke did not choose it. Even her father could not choose it for her. They simply helped Clara reach the place where she finally had enough courage to choose for herself. And perhaps someone listening today is standing at a similar station. Maybe a relationship ended when you thought it would last forever. Maybe a job disappeared. Maybe the future you carefully planned no longer exists. Or perhaps you are wondering why God allowed you to travel so far only to find a closed door waiting at the end. Do not assume that a closed door means the journey was wasted. The place where one dream ends may be the very place where another life begins. And the people God sends into our lives may not always be there to rescue us. Sometimes the right person simply walks beside us, respects the choices we must make for ourselves, and keeps an open hand waiting without ever forcing us to take it. If Clara and Moses reminded you of a moment when God turned an unexpected ending into a new beginning, please share your story in the comments. Someone reading it may need that hope today. And if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone you love. Give the video a like, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, kindness, second chances, and the extraordinary ways people and animals can change one another's lives. Wherever you are tonight, may God give you wisdom when the road divides, courage when a familiar door closes, and faith to recognize the quiet miracles already walking beside you. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you toward the life meant for you. Amen. ***.